Welcome to the Lindamood-Bell radio podcast, where we explore topics in literacy and learning. I'm Dave Hungerford, Lindamood-Bell's Director of Visual Media, and today I'm talking with Melissa Busolo, who's a regional literacy coach for the San Luis Valley BOCES, a collective of schools in Colorado. Welcome and nice to have you here today.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me.
There are two things I'd like to talk to you about today. One, you have an interesting job, which I want to find out about, and two, you do that job in a very contemporary way. First, about the job, we're all familiar with the classroom teacher and teaching reading in the first couple of grades, kindergarten, first, second, and third. Then there's a shift into, instead of learning to read, reading to learn. And we know that there are special ed teachers that help kids that have issues, including reading issues, outside of the classroom. But what exactly is a literacy coach?
So through my job as a literacy coach, what I do is I do a couple of things. One, I work with students who are in intervention groups or receiving extra additional reading support. I also work with teachers in their instruction and their delivery of their instruction. And so there are a couple of focuses that are happening during visits with groups and students. And so like I said, first starting with the students is overall watching students within group, monitoring some of their responses and how the teacher responds to them. And then there's additional work of watching to see what the lesson plan looks like, the instruction looks like for the students, providing coaching for teachers in their language and how they talk to kids, or even how they write their lesson plan for them. And so sometimes I get to just sit back and watch and give feedback afterwards. And other times I get to jump in throughout the session. And sometimes I get to put my teacher cap back on and jump right in and model instruction for teachers.
So these groups, these reading groups, are they for kids in the early grades?
So I actually work with students right now from kindergarten all the way up until middle school. I have a couple of students that I work with that are, I have one student who's a freshman and one student who is also in high school, in his junior year of high school. So it can be students of any age group, and it can also be a small group, so 3 to 5 students, or one-on-one with a student, or it can be a whole classroom of students.
So this school has a system set up where if students are struggling in reading, they are formed into groups outside of the classroom to get special help. Is this through special education or is it through something else?
Well, the way that we approach it is based on school needs. So as you mentioned earlier, for the San Luis Valley, there's a group of school districts. And so I work for the BOCES, which is a Board of Cooperative Educational Services. And what we do is we provide services or we provide educational programs for schools as they need them by districts. So there are 14 districts that participate in our BOCES. And based on each district's specific needs, we provide some coaching and support. So in some districts, it may look like a small group, an intervention group. If you're thinking in terms of RTI, a tier 3 group of 3 to 5 students. In some groups, it might be a tier 2, which is still a targeted intervention group, but not necessarily for a whole classroom of students. And then I do have one school that is working at a tier 1 level where it is the entire classroom of students. And so the groups look different based on the needs of each school district.
Well, it sounds like a district and a group that has a very high priority of literacy. Can you describe what's the San Luis Valley like? I've been lucky enough to be there in center, met you many years ago. How would you describe that area?
I grew up in the San Luis Valley, and so it's rural, very rural. We have a large farming community, and besides farming, we also have most of the people that work there work with education. So there is one college, or actually there are 2 colleges in the San Luis Valley. So we've got Trinidad State Junior College and Adams State University there. So there are people who come into the San Luis Valley for education. And there are those who I would say are lifers who were born and raised there and do continue to contribute back to the San Luis Valley. Like I said, it's very rural, small, we're spread out. So, and there in our 14 districts, there are some districts that are maybe 7 miles apart, where others, it's probably about a 60-mile traveling range. And so we're spread out and we work together so that we can provide services to students in all of those really small rural communities. Because if you know much about rural schools, there aren't a lot of staff members, and those staff members that are there, they wear a lot of hats. And so this is an opportunity for us to provide this service to students based on what the school feels their needs are.
And again, to go back to that literacy focus that the BOCES has adopted, it seems very advanced that they would be able to do and identify something like that. Was there something about the needs of the local population that prompted that focus?
Well, originally, the way that this started was through a grant that the BOCES received. And so the superintendents within the 14 districts, or 14 superintendents, they meet monthly, and they got together, and along with our executive director, they decided that this was something they wanted to focus on. And so we received a grant that was focused on special education when we first started. And so through those funds, we were able to partner with Lindamood-Bell and start this process. And what has happened and what's kind of evolved is, even though the grant ended, we were able to still work together, those 14 districts, to continue to fund a partnership and continue to kind of focus on literacy.
Well, that's great. And there's also something interesting about how you're in a very rural area. You said it's 60 miles in some cases between schools. Where are you located?
I actually, although I grew up in the San Luis Valley, have recently relocated, and I currently live in South Carolina.
And yet you're able to provide coaching services. How's that work out?
It's worked out pretty great, actually. This is something that after our grant and we started working and partnering with Lindamood-Bell, we had decided that we were going to continue on. And then I had a change in my life that had me move out to South Carolina. So I talked with my boss, and we were having a conversation one day about what is this going to look like? Because part of the thing about this partnership in what we're doing in the San Luis Valley is trying to build our own capacity. So we're building our capacity of people in the San Luis Valley who can work together to provide this this type of instruction for kids, and also provide building a network with each other, or educational network with each other. And so when I was going to move, we had a conversation about, what is this going to look like and what are your plans? And we kind of jokingly said, well, maybe we can do it virtually and we can do it online. And my boss, who is amazing, she said, well, let's think about that. Let's think about how that would look. And so, with some conversation, and of course her checking back with the superintendents, because they're the ones who continually do that work and have conversations about what each of their district needs are, we said, let's give it a shot. Let's try that. So after I relocated, I do some site visits, so I get to spend some time there, about quarterly, where I get to go and visit each of the schools, spend time with the students, and continue the coaching piece, and also set up some professional learning communities where we get to meet in person, and then we just carry on with that work when I leave. And so I can log in each day with a new group of students. I can actually see more students now because I'm not traveling between school districts. And so I can just jump online and meet with the group, meet with the teacher, and log out, and then log right back in with another group at another school district.
You're just there virtually via, like you and I are right now, vis-a-vis Skype or Zoom or some sort of technology, and you're right there in the classroom.
Yes, just like that. Most of our schools, they have Promethean boards or smart boards. And so the teachers just log in, and there I am with the students in class, and we have conversations. We do some reading, and I have all of the materials that they're looking at here in front of me, and we just have that conversation.
And it doesn't seem to affect the kids with your presence there. How do they react to that?
They're really open to it. And it's been great because they want to know more about where I am and what I'm doing. And we still start each group session with checking in with them about how they're doing and their progress and things. And they have questions for me. And because I am able to go out there and visit, it goes really well there. And it's funny, the older kids take it right in stride. The younger kids, when I do go out and visit, they're like, "You look so familiar."
I've seen you on TV, right?
You look like that lady in the computer. So it's really it's really a funny thing, but they have been so great with it.
Have there
So
been challenges with that? Is
I think,
other than occasional technology snafus?
of course, there's those technology snafus. I think the biggest challenge is just having been there in the San Luis Valley for a really long time is not being there all the time, of just being able to reach over and cover something up and say, hey, tell me what you pictured for that. Those little things, I've just really had to adjust my instruction and adjust just like you would in any other thing to meet the new way of doing things when you can't just physically reach over and cover up a word in a book and say, tell me what you pictured for that. So those things, but I think that overall the foundation had been set in the first few years that we started, and we had built up that community of teachers. And so with that being set and that foundation being laid, it kind of was an easier transition for me.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of professional development has gone that route to
Right.
on-demand, workshops that are online as opposed to going to the conferences, and it saves money and time. It seems to be a great convenience for everybody once you get used to maybe as a presenter speaking into the void and not getting the feedback directly, or even as a participant, just not having that direct in-person touch. But it sounds like you're doing a pretty good mix of both, being able to get out there a couple, 3 times a year. What has been one of the most rewarding parts of being a literacy coach?
Watching students read and seeing students at one point say to you, I can't do this, or I can't read this, or I don't like reading, and then not very long after, can I please read this to you? And so watching student success is just such an amazing thing. And I would say that that's been the best part of it. And also, instructors, watching them gain confidence and work with students and understand what students' responses mean, how to respond to what students are doing, and really just being able to say, I understand how to teach reading. And so I think both of those things have been truly rewarding for me and is why I continue to do this job even from far away.
Well, let me ask about the groups themselves. How do you put together these groups of students? How do you
Well,
identify them, and what makes them part of one group as opposed to part of another?
that looks different at each school district. But for the most part, when we're looking at a targeted Tier 3 intervention group, we are looking for students who, within their current level of testing, are showing a great need. So students who may fall below the 10th percentile in certain areas in reading, we're looking at all of the assessments that schools are already doing and then identifying students who are showing a need for support in reading. Once that
Teachers know this, but the state test is certainly probably the primary cut, but in addition, there are many tests that schools often give to kids in the classroom, aren't there?
Yeah, there are. So there are lots of progress monitoring tests that teachers are giving. There's beginning of the year benchmark tests. So when a student comes into school at the beginning of the year, teachers are checking to find out where they're entering at and what kind of needs they have, what kind of strengths they have. And then from those beginning of the year benchmark tests, then teachers and administrators start to identify kids who have needs in reading. If a need is detected and we're talking about what can we do from here, then we sometimes give additional tests. So for our targeted tier 3 intervention groups, we're giving a Lindamood-Bell battery of tests. And that's what we've been doing from the beginning of the grant that we received. And it's a practice we continue to do. Now, a group that may be at a tier 2 level, which needs some support, some targeted support, but maybe not as much, they're not as far behind. So if we're talking about grade levels, if we're talking about a student who maybe is half a year behind or a year behind versus 2 or 3 years behind, maybe they don't need as much time. And so what we're doing is we're looking at tests that are given within the classroom as a progress monitoring. And these are tests that are administered to all students. And so it's data that's already there. And we use those to group students. And so some groups of students are really strategic in the terms of we've got lots of different data points that we're grouping them by. Whereas a tier 2, we may be looking specifically at reading fluency, reading rate or accuracy, and we might be looking specifically at word attack, and we might group those students together, and they may not have as far to go. So it really depends on what our initial data tells us, the next steps we take for grouping students. But everything goes back to what do we know about the students? It's not just, is a student struggling to read? Okay, let's put them in a group. It's more of the student is struggling to read. Let's talk about why they're struggling to read. What is it that they need, and would they pair well with this other student? And then we are responding with our instruction and with our lesson plans, and based on each of those needs.
So it's not just the grouping that you use these real specific tests, it's also what type of instruction you're going to do. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. So we focus on decoding. So we're just teaching reading, and then there's also the comprehension piece of it. So we may have students who need some extra support in vocabulary and understanding what they read. Sometimes students read really well, and you can put just about any book in front of them and they can read it to you and it sounds great. But then when you ask them what they read about, they may not be able to tell you. And so they might require some extra comprehension support. And that happens sometimes.
And that's what the state test won't tell you. You read several paragraphs and answer questions. You don't know if they missed the question because they didn't understand what they read or because their decoding or just reading the words themselves was so laborious that they couldn't even get to the part about thinking about the question itself, right?
Right. So we're not sure why they might have missed a question in those tests. Yeah. So the other test that we're giving, it's more of a progress monitoring in terms of some of the, some schools use dibbles. And so students are reading, we can look right at the probe of what they read out loud and see what kind of errors were made and see how far the student got. And it tells us so much about our students. And that's really something that I've learned over the course of the years is important, is not just saying, all right, we need to practice reading more, but we need to really focus on what we're practicing in reading. Do I need more help with word attack? Do I need more help with symbol imagery? Am I needing some extra support on just having that text in front of me and practicing some reading with my teacher there who's also listening and providing feedback as I read? So I just think that my picture of how to teach reading, how to teach students how to read, has changed so much over the last few years.
That's a good distinction, teaching reading versus teaching students how to read. You're not
Yeah.
just putting it out there into a vacuum. How would you describe, are your students, do they vary over this wide area of the San Luis Valley? Is there a wide demographic variance of the students from school to school? Or is it pretty similar?
Um, I would say that each district, I mean, we're pretty similar. We're all from the San Luis Valley, but in terms of each school district, of course, they have their own demographics and their own needs. And so, really, what our focus has been responding to what they're telling us they need rather than saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do for you. This is what I can provide you, and this is the only thing that I can provide you. It's not necessarily like that. It's tell not just tell me who your students are, but let me come in, let me meet your students, let me work with your teachers, and you tell me what kind of plan you would like to approach these needs for reading. And that's something that I think is really important to districts because they are unique in their own ways to an extent. And then there's that overall school kind of picture that binds us where we all have some similarities, and one of those big similarities is the need for reading support for some kids. For some kids it comes naturally, and and or it within that tier 1 instruction, that whole group instruction, that's enough. And sometimes as a student, I might just need a little extra support. So I think that overall, the San Luis Valley, um, we're all similar in terms of we're all from a rural area. And we know that place, and that farming piece is huge, the ranching piece is huge, and just the way that people treat each other is so amazing, and we're all working together. But there are some uniquenesses to each of the different districts.
Sure. And during, say, the course of a week, how many teachers and students do you work with?
Oh, wow. um, it varies from day to day because most of what we do is a response to what students' needs are or what we saw. But I can visit anywhere from 3 to 4 schools virtually in a day. When I was on site, it was it was 2 schools, and depending on how they set up their schedules, if all their groups happen at one time, let's say they all happen within the same hour block, it really limits how many students I can see. So that would limit it to maybe up to 10 if I'm in a small group intervention school that's working on small group interventions, or 2 classrooms if I'm working in a school that's working with tier 1 instruction. But up to 3 to 4 school districts a day, I can see 4 or 5 groups at least, at a minimum.
Wow, that's pretty good. Are you the only literacy coach in the BOCES?
Well, I am the regional literacy coach, but each school district, we have identified leaders in their school. So there's a person, a contact person at every point. And I don't mean to minimize their role, because contact person just means, I'm reaching out to them, but somebody who is writing the lesson plans and also coaching, may also be coaching other teachers as well. But as far as for the whole valley, I service 13 of the 14 school districts.
Well, that keeps you very busy, I'm sure. And that reminds me of another topic that's kind of come up in educationalese, and that's the talk about instructional fatigue. You're familiar with that phrase, I'm sure. How would you define that?
So when I think of instructional fatigue, I picture just as a teacher where you're doing something every year and you've been doing it for a few years, and there gets to be a point where you've done it for so long that you might get tired of providing that instruction in that way. And so some teachers are really great about making something fun and new every day. When you have been working with a specific program or process for a long time, you can have some instructional fatigue of, I've got this, I know what to do. And, the PLCs may seem kind of redundant.
The PLC being from?
professional learning community, that support that you're getting. So really just kind of addressing what teachers are really good at, allowing them to be individuals and continuing to help them grow and finding new ways to support that. So when I'm thinking of instructional fatigue, it's just I've been doing this for a really long time. I'm pretty sure I've got it if I'm speaking as the teacher, but how do we make that new every year, and how do we make that fun, and how do we keep teachers engaged and students engaged in something that we've spent a long time doing?
And not just in fatigue, but in the literacy and reading itself, you've obviously been successful. The grant that you originally had for the Haskin Elementary School, it's well documented, all the great gains that they've had. Has that maintained over the past 5 years?
So in Haskin, they've had some changes, and so with changes, and I'm talking in terms of administration and just focus changes, because every school is kind of evolving, and as they continue to move on, they may address new needs, or new needs may come up. And so when you talk about Haskin, when we were first identified as a turnaround school district, one of our greatest needs was literacy support. And as you mentioned, it was well documented, the growth that was made within those few years. The first 3 years at Haskin. And so I would say that there's been, along with some changes with their administration, there's also been some changes for what they see as their needs. So to answer your question about, is it still the same? It's not necessarily. I know that they have some other focuses. I do work with Haskin still through the BOCES. We've got a couple of groups, so they still identify students that are in need of Tier 3 instruction, and we've got a couple of groups and a couple of leaders there who provide instruction, but they also do other things around that. So I would say it's not the same in that they've had a kind of a change in their focus of what they're working on, but they still do utilize the reading process that we started with to an extent.
Well, that's good. And I'm sure for certain students, the ones that make some great changes, that's all that matters. So if you want to see Melissa and her colleagues in action, go to the Lindamood-Bell YouTube page, and there are 3 videos. There's one entitled Haskin Elementary School in Center, Colorado. Another one, Lindamood-Bell's turnaround success in Center, Colorado. And Lindamood-Bell's partnership in Monte Vista, Colorado. Thank you so much for being here today, and wish you the best in your continued work from afar in the Valley. Thanks for being on Lindamood-Bell Radio.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to the Lindamood-Bell Radio Podcast. I hope you listen to more episodes. If you enjoy this, please subscribe, and you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Lindamood-Bell.